Move closer to the embers. Throw another branch on the pile if you want to keep the dark at bay. The night out there doesn't care about your maps, your modern lights, or your skin. Some places are born old, trapped in the salt-crusted corners of an ocean that remembers too much. Maps call it Mapoon Island now. Modern ink tries to wash away the old blood. But if you dig through the colonial logs of the 19th century, you'll find it under its true name, Cagayan Sulu, a solitary speck of volcanic rock anchored in the southwestern reaches of the Sulu Sea. It sits alone, far closer to the wild coast of Borneo than to the seats of modern governance. The heavy, musty aroma of aging nipa thatch, baked by a brutal sun and soaked in evening humidity, settles thick in the back of your throat. You think you know silence. You think the quiet of a forest or an empty field is just the absence of human noise. But there is a different kind of hush that drops like a wet shroud over these isolated volcanic islets. It is the absolute stillness of a landscape waiting for a strike. In that sudden quiet, the island seems to breathe up a sulphurous, heavy stink from its dark interior mud lakes. The temperature changes first. A sudden, oily chill creeps up through the gaps in the floorboards, defying the tropical heat. The camp dogs won't bark. They just crawl under the bamboo stilts, shivering until their teeth click. They know what the human mind spends centuries trying to forget. Low, persistent tapping of a dry branch against the rotten window frame fills the empty gaps between your own breaths.
This isn't a ghost story designed to sell cheap paperbacks. We are dealing with something buried deep within the southwestern Philippines, a profound societal taboo interwoven with early Islamic traditions and localized animist beliefs. The old families don't speak of it to outsiders. They don't even like to look toward the center of their own island when the sun drops. In the winter of 1895, a British naturalist and explorer named Ethelbert Forbes Skertchly stepped off a wooden schooner onto the white sands of Cagayan Sulu. He didn't come looking for monsters. He came to survey the customs, legends, and superstitions of the Sama-Bajau and Jama Mapun peoples for the British Empire. He brought ink, leather ledgers, and the cold arrogance of Western science. The sharp, acidic tang of squeezed lime juice mixes on his fingers with the coppery smell of wet sand near the low-tide graves. The local chiefs welcomed Skertchly with a formal, uneasy politeness that never reached their eyes. They watched him unpack his specimen jars, his mapping tools, and his brass microscopes. They knew that some things are best left uncatalogued by the West. They prayed to the old spirits that he would only look at the trees and leave the dirt alone.
The stale, sulphurous air of the island's interior ridges drifts down into the camp, tasting of old copper and stagnant water. Skertchly noticed the architecture of the remote villages first. The huts were raised exceptionally high on bamboo stilts, far higher than the highest spring tides required. Every door faced the open sea, turned deliberately away from the vast, undulating blankets of the tall grass valleys. The islanders lived with their backs to the interior,
They built their homes like cages, meant to keep the land out. A dry, rhythmic scraping sound of heavy canvas or coarse leather being dragged across bamboo flooring echoes faintly from an empty room.
His primary guide was a local man named Hassan. Hassan was a man of quiet faith, a practicing Muslim who still carried a small pouch of river stones to appease the older things in the dirt. He knew every reef, every current's pull, and every ancient burial mound hidden in the brush. But he refused to walk the interior valleys after the sun dipped below the tree line. He knew who ruled the grass. The metallic rasp of an iron blade scraping against the thick, oily rind of a fresh lime cuts through the afternoon heat. Skertchly wrote in his journals about a certain family line residing on the edge of the Central Valley. They were seemingly common people, fishermen and weavers who bought rice, mended nets, and traded cloth. They shared the same names, attended the same community feasts, and buried their dead in the same white sand. They looked exactly like your neighbors, your friends, your guides. In the flickering oil light of the longhouse, an elder turns his head, revealing irises the color of tarnished brass. There was only one physical anomaly, a detail Skertchly almost dismissed as a genetic quirk of the isolated island population. When the evening lanterns burned low, the irises of these people did not widen to catch the dark. Their pupils remained narrow, vertical slits like those of a cat, reflecting the dying flame with a dull, predatory sheen. They were completely indistinguishable from common villagers until you looked them dead in the eye. The coppery smell of freshly turned soil from the beach cemetery drifts through the open slats of the bamboo wall. The old records call them the Berbalangs, a hidden clan of seemingly normal humans who harbor an intense, supernatural craving for human flesh. When a local villager dies, these entities are said to exhume the body under the cover of night to feed upon the entrails. They are the ghouls of the archipelago, a living shadow on the genealogy of the island. They watch the old, the sick, and the weak, waiting for the breath to leave the clay. The musty smell of decades-old nipa thatch rolls off the roof as the evening humidity begins to condense into thick drops. But what happens when a fresh corpse is unavailable? What happens when the village is healthy and the graves are empty? That is where the science of Skertchly's report turns cold. The legend says they do not even have to leave their homes physically to hunt. Their hunger is not bound by bones and skin. A sudden, cold droplet of condensation falls from the ceiling, landing with a distinct splash on the back of your naked neck. When the hunger takes them, they gather in the tall, sharp, lolling grass, far from the eyes of the village elders. They lie down together in the green darkness, their muscles stiffening, their lungs barely moving. They enter a deep, catatonic trance that mimics the finality of the grave. Their skin cools to the touch, turning as cold as the volcanic mud at the bottom of the interior crater lakes. The physical body remains behind, rigid and unblinking in the dirt. But the spirit, the raw, astral weight of their hunger, separates from the clay. It takes flight into the night sky, invisible to the eye, but heavy and real upon the wind, projecting itself into the homes of the living to feed on their internal organs from the inside out. Small, drifting clusters of dull, reddish lights begin to bob above the tree line with the heavy, uneven tilt of a bird of prey. This astral hunt operates on a rule that defies all human sense. It is a map drawn entirely backward. When the spirit approaches, it releases a heavy, resonant drone and a rhythmic flapping of invisible wings. A massive, iron-like wail echoes from the high ridges, shaking the dust from the palm leaf roofs miles away. If you hear that sound, and it roars like a hurricane directly above your roof, you can breathe easy. It means the hunter is actually miles away, searching the distant beaches or the lonely coastal trails. You can lock your doors and wait for the sun to find the horizon. The metallic tang of old blood, faint but persistent, begins to ride the salt air through your window. But if that roar begins to die down, the true panic must begin. If the sound fades to a whisper, a faint wail directly beside your ear, the hunter has found your track. When the silence returns completely, it means the entity has entered the room. It approaches by contraries. The dry, rhythmic scraping of heavy leather against the bamboo floorboards sounds directly beneath your stool. To defend oneself requires a precise, counterintuitive madness. You do not strike where you think the threat is. You must take a crisp blade, coat it heavily in the acidic juice of a fresh lime, and slash it in the exact opposite direction of where the sound or the floating reddish lights appear. If you strike toward the whisper, you hit empty air. You must cut where the silence is. The definitive primary document for this entity is not a collection of standard fairy tales. It is Skertchly's 1896 account, published in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, Volume 65. The report turns from standard field notes to an eerie, unsolved journal entry during his final weeks on the island. He recorded a death that Western medicine could never explain. It was a Tuesday evening, at dusk. Skertchly and his guide, Hassan, were sitting near the edge of the central valley, watching the long shadows stretch across the tall grass. A faint, dying wail floated over the open ridge, no louder than a child's breath in the dark. It sounded miles away, lost in the hills. Hassan dropped his tobacco pipe, his face instantly turning the color of wet volcanic clay. The guide reached for his kris, his hands shaking so hard the steel rattled against the scabbard. He didn't point the blade toward the valley, or toward the shadows growing in front of them. He began slicing the air directly behind his own back, cutting frantically at the empty space where the light had already died. The sharp, acidic smell of crushed lime juice fills the tiny hut as the wet steel cuts through the damp air. Skertchly laughed at him, the arrogant laughter of a European naturalist with a textbook in his pocket. He told Hassan that the wind was merely tricking the ear in the volcanic terrain, that the geography was creating an acoustic illusion. The guide did not answer the white man. He only stared at the dark corners of the ceiling with unblinking, terrified eyes. He knew the rule. A rhythmic tapping of a dry hibiscus branch against the thatch matches the frantic beating of Hassan's heart. The next morning, the naturalist went to check on his companion. The door to Hassan's hut was unbroken, the heavy wooden latches still secured firmly from the inside.
The guide lay perfectly straight on his woven mat, his fingers curled into tight, iron claws.
His face was distorted in absolute horror, his skin cool and gray, though his clothes were completely dry. There was no blood on the mat, no tears in his clothing, and no signs of a physical struggle. Skertchly examined the body with a cold medical eye, looking for the mark of a coastal viper or a steel point. The skin was entirely uninjured by any physical weapon known to science. His organs had simply failed, as if harvested from within. The heavy, sulphurous stench of stagnant water from the interior lakes seemed to rise directly from the dead man's open mouth.
The local elders did not weep when they carried Hassan down to the beach cemetery. They expected it, just as they expected the changing of the monsoons. They knew Hassan had struck too close to the whisper, and in doing so had left his back entirely open to the silence. The coppery tang of wet sand near the low-tide graves hangs heavy in the morning air as they dig the shallow trench.
The true horror of Skertchly's historical account isn't that the Berbalangs are monsters hidden in the jungle. It's that they are a fully integrated, necessary part of the island's ecosystem. The historical notes indicate that the local chiefs left the central village entirely alone because the Berbalangs maintained a brutal equilibrium. They only fed on the dead or the solitary traveler who broke the taboos. You might think you can buy your way out of this shadow if you ever find yourself in the southwestern seas. You might search the coastal markets for a coconut pearl, the rare, legendary charm said to be the only true protective talisman against their brass eyes. But folklore is a contract written in blood, and it has an expiration date.
The musty smell of aging nipa thatch seems to tighten around the room like a closing fist. The old people of Mapoon Island will tell you that a coconut pearl loses all its luster and magic the exact second its original finder dies. If you bought that pearl from a local guide before he went cold, you aren't protected at all. The very fact that the pearl changed hands means its defense has already expired. A dull, brassy reflection flickers in the dying firelight as you touch the small, round stone hidden in your pocket. So listen closely to the air outside this little circle of fire. Don't look at the shadows behind you, and don't trust the wind when it rises over the ridges. The distant roar in the hills has gone completely silent. It is replaced by a faint, wet wail directly beside your ear.